Margaret O'Sullivan stood alone at the edge of the crowd, her weathered hands clutching a faded photograph of her late husband in his army dress blues. The Veterans' Day ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery was in full swing, but nobody seemed to notice the elderly woman in the simple black coat and worn shoes. Politicians gave speeches about honor and sacrifice while cameras captured their every gesture, but Margaret remained invisible among the sea of military families and dignitaries. At 73, she had grown accustomed to being overlooked. Since Patrick's death 15 years ago, the world had moved on without her. Their children lived across the country, too busy with their own lives to visit. The military benefits barely covered her rent in the small apartment in Alexandria, Virginia, where she lived alone, with only Patrick's medals and memories for company. "Excuse me, ma'am," a young soldier said, trying to squeeze past her toward the front of the crowd. He didn't even look at her face as he pushed by, eager to get a better view of the ceremony. Margaret stepped aside quietly, as she always did. She'd learned long ago that an old widow's presence didn't matter to anyone. Not to the grocery store clerks who treated her like an inconvenience, not to the doctors who rushed through her appointments, and certainly not to the military officials who had forgotten that behind every medal was a family that had sacrificed everything. The ceremony featured the usual parade of high-ranking officers, each one decorated with ribbons and awards that caught the sunlight. They spoke eloquently about the price of freedom and the debt owed to those who served. But as Margaret listened, she couldn't help but think about the price paid by those who stayed behind. The wives who raised children alone, who worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, who aged in solitude while the world celebrated their husbands' service. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Master of Ceremonies announced, "please welcome General Marcus Thompson, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff." The crowd erupted in applause as a tall, distinguished man in his early 60s approached the podium. General Thompson was a living legend in military circles, a decorated combat veteran who had served 5 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq before rising to the highest position in the American military hierarchy. His chest bore the weight of ribbons and medals that told the story of a lifetime of service. Margaret watched him with a mixture of respect and sadness. Men like General Thompson were celebrated and remembered, while women like her simply faded away. Patrick had been a good soldier, serving 2 tours in Vietnam before coming home to work at the Pentagon for 30 years, but he wasn't a general or a war hero in the traditional sense. He was just a dedicated sergeant who did his duty, and now he lay in Section 60 with thousands of other forgotten soldiers. As General Thompson began his speech, Margaret felt a familiar ache in her chest. The words were beautiful and moving, but they felt hollow somehow. How many of these officials had actually lived the reality they spoke about? How many had held their spouse's hand as they died, knowing that their sacrifice would be forgotten within a generation? "We gather here today not just to honor the dead," General Thompson said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd, "but to remember that freedom is not free. Every headstone in this sacred ground represents not just a soldier, but a family. A wife who became a widow, children who grew up without a father, parents who buried their sons and daughters." Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes. Perhaps this general was different. Perhaps he understood. "But we must ask ourselves," the general continued, "are we truly honoring their sacrifice if we forget the families they left behind? Are we keeping faith with our fallen if we ignore the widows and orphans who carry on their legacy?" The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. Margaret found herself moving slightly closer, drawn by the authenticity in the general's voice. I want to tell you about a letter I received last week," General Thompson said, reaching into his pocket. "It was from an elderly widow who lives here in Alexandria. She wrote to me about her husband, Sergeant Patrick O'Sullivan, who served 2 tours in Vietnam and spent 30 years at the Pentagon. She didn't write asking for anything. She just wanted someone to remember his name." Margaret's heart stopped. The photograph in her hands began to shake as she realized what was happening. "Mrs. Margaret O'Sullivan wrote that she feels invisible, forgotten by a country that her husband served with distinction. She told me that she struggles to pay her bills on her military pension, that she spends holidays alone, and that sometimes she wonders if Patrick's service mattered at all. The crowd was completely silent now. Margaret felt every eye in the cemetery turning to search for her, but she stood frozen, unable to move or speak. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," General Thompson said, looking directly at her across the crowd, "if you're here today, I want you to know that your husband's service did matter, and your sacrifice matters too." Margaret felt the crowd parting around her as people realized who she was. Some began to applaud softly, others simply stared with newfound respect. But Margaret only had eyes for the general, who had somehow found her letter among the thousands of pieces of mail that must cross his desk. "You see," General Thompson continued, "Mrs. O'Sullivan's letter reminded me of something we often forget in all our ceremonies and speeches. For every soldier who gave their life in service to this country, there's usually a spouse who gave their life too, just in a different way. They sacrificed their dreams, their security, and their future. They raised children alone, worked extra jobs, and grew old in the shadow of their spouse's service." Margaret felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. She turned to see a young woman in Air Force dress blues standing beside her, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," the woman whispered, "for everything you've sacrificed." More people began to approach Margaret, but she remained focused on General Thompson, who was still speaking. Mrs. O'Sullivan's husband, Sergeant Patrick O'Sullivan, earned the Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Vietnam Service Medal during his time in combat. But perhaps more importantly, he earned the love and devotion of a woman who has spent the last 15 years keeping his memory alive while the rest of us moved on with our lives. The general paused, looking directly at Margaret again. "Ma'am, would you please come forward?" Margaret shook her head slightly, overwhelmed by the attention. She had never wanted this. She had only written the letter because she was lonely and needed someone to know that Patrick had existed. "Please," the general said gently, "we need to hear from you." The crowd began to part, creating a path from where Margaret stood to the podium. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, some curious, some respectful, some moved to tears. These were the same people who had ignored her just minutes ago, but now they were looking at her with something that resembled reverence. With trembling legs, Margaret began to walk toward the front of the crowd. Each step felt surreal, as if she were moving through a dream. The faded photograph of Patrick remained clutched in her hands, and she could almost feel his presence encouraging her forward. As she approached the podium, General Thompson stepped down to meet her. Up close, she could see the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine emotion that had driven him to share her story with the world. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," he said quietly, "thank you for reminding us what this day is really about." Margaret looked out at the sea of faces now focused entirely on her. For the first time in 15 years, she felt seen. For the first time since Patrick's funeral, she felt like her voice mattered. But what she saw in the crowd also worried her. There were other elderly women standing alone, other forgotten widows who had probably never received a letter from a general. How many Margaret O'Sullivans were there, invisible and struggling, while the country they had served forgot their sacrifice? As the moment stretched on, Margaret realized that this was just the beginning. General Thompson had given her a platform, but what she did with it would determine whether Patrick's sacrifice, and her own, would truly be remembered. The crowd of 2,000 people stood in complete silence as Margaret O'Sullivan reached the podium. General Thompson handed her the microphone with a gentle nod, and for a moment she simply stared out at the sea of faces that had suddenly turned to focus on her. Politicians, military officers, Gold Star families and veterans, all waiting to hear from the woman who had been invisible just minutes before. I don't know what to say," Margaret began, her voice barely audible through the speakers. "I never expected this. I just wrote a letter because I was lonely and wanted someone to remember my Patrick. Her words carried across Arlington Cemetery with simple honesty that cut through the formal atmosphere of the ceremony. In the crowd, other elderly women began to step forward slightly, recognizing something of themselves in Margaret's story. My husband wasn't a general or a war hero," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. "He was just a good man who did his duty. He came home from Vietnam with nightmares and scars, but he never complained. He worked at the Pentagon for 30 years, came home every night to help with homework, and never missed one of our children's school plays." General Thompson stood beside her, his expression grave as he listened to the reality behind the statistics and speeches. "When Patrick died 15 years ago, it felt like the world forgot him immediately," Margaret said. "The military gave me a folded flag and a pension that barely covers my rent. Our children moved away to build their own lives. The neighbors stopped checking on me, and slowly I became invisible." In the crowd, Senator Robert Hayes shifted uncomfortably. As chairman of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, he had been one of the main speakers at today's ceremony, talking about America's commitment to its veterans. But he couldn't remember the last time he had actually met with a military widow or asked about their struggles. "I'm not telling you this to complain," Margaret said, noticing the politicians in the front row. "I'm telling you this because I know I'm not alone. There are thousands of women like me, living in small apartments and counting pennies, wondering if anyone remembers what we gave up." Colonel Sarah Martinez, a 45-year-old Army officer standing near the front, felt tears streaming down her face. Her own mother had been a military widow, struggling to raise 3 children alone after her father was killed in the Gulf War. She remembered the loneliness, the financial stress, and the way society seemed to forget that military families continued to sacrifice long after the uniform came off. "Patrick used to tell me that being a military spouse was the hardest job in the Army," Margaret continued. "You're married to someone whose first loyalty is to the country. You move every 2 years, leaving friends and starting over. You raise children alone during deployments. And if something happens to your spouse, you face the rest of your life knowing that their job came first, even at the end." General Thompson found himself thinking about his own wife, Patricia, who had spent 27 years following him from base to base, raising their 3 children while he deployed repeatedly. How many dinner parties had she attended alone? How many school events had she handled by herself? How many nights had she lain awake worrying whether he would come home alive? "But here's what I want you to understand," Margaret said, her voice now carrying clearly across the silent cemetery. "We chose this life because we believed in something bigger than ourselves. We believed in the country our husbands served. We believed that our sacrifice mattered, that someone would remember." Media cameras that had been focusing on the politicians were now zoomed in on Margaret, capturing every word for the evening news. This wasn't the story they had come to cover, but it was becoming the most important story of the day. "I wrote to General Thompson because I was desperate," Margaret admitted, "not for money or attention, but for acknowledgement. I needed someone to know that Patrick O'Sullivan existed, that he mattered, that his sacrifice and mine weren't forgotten." Behind the crowd, Mrs. Dorothy Chen, widow of Master Sergeant James Chen, began walking toward the front. At 81, she had been living on Social Security and a small military pension since her husband died 8 years ago. Margaret's words had given her courage to step out of the shadows. "General Thompson," Margaret said, turning to face him, "I want to thank you for reading my letter and for sharing Patrick's story. But I also want to ask you something. How many other letters like mine are sitting in your office? How many other widows are invisible?" The general's jaw tightened as he considered the question. In truth, he received dozens of similar letters every month. Widows struggling with poverty, loneliness, and neglect. Most were handled by his staff with form letters and referrals to Veterans Affairs. Margaret's letter had stood out only because she had asked for nothing except recognition. "Mum," he said quietly, "too many, far too many." Margaret nodded, unsurprised by his honesty. "Then we have work to do." She turned back to the crowd, and her next words would be replayed on news programs across the country for weeks to come. I'm not asking for pity or charity. I'm asking for recognition. Not just for me, but for all the women who are living in the shadow of their husband's service. We need to be seen. We need to be remembered. And we need to know that our sacrifices still matter to the country we helped serve. Mrs. Chen had reached the edge of the crowd now, and she called out, "Mrs. O'Sullivan, I'm Dorothy Chen. My James served 3 tours in Iraq. I've been invisible for 8 years. Another voice joined her. "Barbara Williams, my Robert died in Afghanistan. I'm invisible too." One by one, other military widows began identifying themselves, their voices creating a chorus of forgotten sacrifice. General Thompson watched in amazement as dozens of elderly women stepped forward from the crowd, many of them probably having attended Veterans Day ceremonies for years without anyone noticing them. Senator Hayes approached the microphone, clearly shaken by what he was witnessing. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, what can Congress do? What do you need?" Margaret looked at him with eyes that had seen too much disappointment to trust politicians easily. "Senator, Congress passes bills about veteran benefits, but do you know what it's actually like to live on a military widow's pension? Do you know what it costs to buy groceries when you're 73 and living alone?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Senator Hayes had voted on numerous veterans' bills, but he realized he had no idea what the actual lived experience was like for the families left behind. "I propose something," Margaret said, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had found her purpose. "Before Congress votes on any more veterans' legislation, they should spend a day with a military widow. Not a photo op, not a meeting in your office. Actually visit our apartments. Go grocery shopping with us. See what your policies look like in real life." The crowd erupted in applause, but Margaret wasn't finished. "And General Thompson," she said, turning back to him, "the military needs to remember that when a soldier dies, their spouse doesn't stop serving. We carry on their legacy, often in poverty and isolation. We deserve better than form letters and forgotten promises." General Thompson stepped forward, and what he did next would make headlines around the world. He slowly raised his hand in a crisp military salute directed at Margaret. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," he said formally, "on behalf of the United States military, I apologize for forgetting you, and I promise you this: your service will be invisible no longer." The salute lasted 30 seconds, but it felt like eternity. 2,000 people watched as the highest-ranking military officer in America formally recognized not just Margaret's sacrifice, but the sacrifice of every military spouse who had ever lived in the shadow of service. When he finally lowered his hand, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in 15 years: hope. But she also knew that this moment, powerful as it was, would mean nothing if it didn't lead to real change. The cameras would leave, the politicians would go back to Washington, and the world would move on, unless she made sure that this day was remembered for more than just words. Within hours of Margaret O'Sullivan's impromptu speech, social media exploded with videos of the elderly widow confronting America's military and political leadership. The hashtag #InvisibleWidows began trending worldwide as military families shared their own stories of forgotten sacrifice. By evening, Margaret's simple black coat and weathered hands had become symbols of a hidden crisis that the country could no longer ignore. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, this is CNN," said the reporter, who'd been calling Margaret's phone non-stop since she returned to her small Alexandria apartment. "We'd like to interview you for tonight's broadcast." Margaret sat in her worn armchair, still wearing the same clothes from the ceremony, staring at Patrick's medals displayed on the side table. The attention was overwhelming, but she knew this was her only chance to make sure today's moment led to lasting change. "I'll do the interview," she told the CNN producer. "But I want Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Williams there too. This isn't about me alone." 3 hours later, Margaret found herself in a CNN studio with Dorothy Chen and Barbara Williams, facing anchor Anderson Cooper. The three women looked small and out of place under the bright television lights, but their presence commanded attention in a way that no politician's speech could match. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," Cooper began, "your speech today has been viewed over 5 million times already. Did you expect this kind of response?" "I didn't expect anyone to listen at all," Margaret replied honestly. "I just wanted someone to remember Patrick's name. But seeing all these other women step forward today, I realized that we're not invisible because people are cruel. We're invisible because people don't know how to see us." At the Pentagon, General Thompson was watching the interview from his office, surrounded by his senior staff. The phones had been ringing constantly since the ceremony, with calls from veterans, organizations, congressional offices, and media outlets around the world. "No, sir," said Colonel Jennifer Park, his chief of staff. "We're getting reports from military bases across the country. Spouses and widows are organizing meetings, sharing stories. This is becoming a movement." "Good," Thompson replied, though his expression was troubled. "It should have been a movement decades ago." On television, Dorothy Chen was sharing her story. "After my James died, the Army moved me out of base housing within 90 days. I had to find a new apartment, a new job, a new life, all while grieving my husband. The survivor benefits barely covered my rent, and nobody told me about the programs that might help. I felt like I had been erased." Barbara Williams nodded in agreement. "The military takes care of you when you're an active duty family, but the moment your spouse dies, you're a civilian problem. The Defense Department says you're the VA's responsibility. The VA says you're a Social Security issue. Everyone passes you along until you just give up asking for help." Cooper turned to Margaret. "What do you want to see change?" Margaret had been thinking about this question all day. "First, we need a real support system for military widows that doesn't end when the funeral is over. Second, we need survivor benefits that actually cover the cost of living in 2024, not 1974. And third, we need to be included in veterans' services, not treated like we're separate from our husband's service." At his home in McLean, Virginia, Senator Hayes was also watching the interview. His wife, Catherine, sat beside him on the couch, tears streaming down her face. "Bob," she said quietly, "how did we not know about this? How did Congress not know that military widows were struggling like this?" Senator Hayes had been asking himself the same question. As chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee, he had overseen billions in veterans spending, but he realized that most of it went to active duty benefits and medical care. Widow support was an afterthought, managed by bureaucratic systems that seemed designed to discourage rather than help. "We knew," he admitted. "We just didn't want to see it. It's easier to give speeches about honoring veterans than to actually take care of their families." The interview continued, with Cooper asking about the other widows who had stepped forward at Arlington. Margaret estimated that at least 50 women had identified themselves publicly, with hundreds more reaching out through social media. "We're planning to meet this weekend," Margaret said. "Not to complain, but to organize. If the system won't see us, we'll make ourselves impossible to ignore." At Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Major Lisa Rodriguez was watching the interview with her husband, also a military officer. They had been married for 12 years, and she had never really thought about what would happen to her if he was killed in action. "That could be me," she said quietly. "If something happens to you overseas, I could end up like Mrs. O'Sullivan, invisible and forgotten." Similar conversations were happening in military homes across the country as active duty spouses suddenly realized how precarious their future security really was. Back in the CNN studio, Cooper was asking about General Thompson's salute. "What did that moment mean to you?" Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully. "It meant that someone with real authority finally acknowledged what we've given to this country. But a salute is just a gesture. What matters is what happens next, and what should happen next. General Thompson and the Pentagon need to create a real office for military family affairs, run by people who understand what it's like to live this life. Congress needs to pass legislation that treats military widows as veterans in their own right. with full access to benefits and services. And the American people need to remember that when they thank a veteran for their service, they should also thank the family that served alongside them. Dorothy Chen leaned forward. And we need young military families to plan for this possibility. Nobody wants to think about becoming a widow, but if you don't prepare for it, you'll end up like us, struggling alone with no idea where to turn for help. The interview concluded with Cooper asking each woman what they wanted their legacy to be. Margaret answered last. I want military widows to never feel invisible again. I want them to know that their sacrifice matters, that their country remembers them, and that they have a voice in how they're treated. Patrick died believing that his service made America stronger. I want my service as his widow to make America better for the families that serve. As the cameras stopped rolling, Margaret felt exhausted but determined. The real work was just beginning. Over the next 48 hours, the Invisible Widow's story dominated news cycles. Military widow support groups formed spontaneously across the country. Active duty spouses began demanding better information about survivor benefits, and politicians who had ignored the issue for decades suddenly found themselves under pressure to act. But Margaret knew that media attention was fleeting. If she wanted real change, she needed to transform this moment of visibility into sustained political action. And she was about to discover that she had powerful allies she never expected. On Wednesday morning, Margaret's phone rang with a call that would change everything. Mrs. O'Sullivan, this is Patricia Thompson, General Thompson's wife. I've been a military spouse for 27 years, and after watching your interview, I realized that I've been preparing to become you my entire marriage. I want to help, and I have some ideas about how we can make this change permanent. Margaret smiled for the first time since Patrick's funeral 15 years ago. She was no longer invisible, and she was no longer alone. Patricia Thompson's spacious home in Fort Myer overlooked the Potomac River, but Margaret O'Sullivan barely noticed the expensive furnishings or the wall covered with photos of the general's military career. She was focused on the woman sitting across from her, the wife of America's highest-ranking military officer, who had just admitted that she lived in constant fear of becoming exactly like Margaret. "And I've attended dozens of military funerals," Patricia said, pouring tea from fine china that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. "I've watched wives receive folded flags and wondered what happened to them afterward. But I never asked. I never followed up. I was too afraid of facing my own future." Margaret studied Patricia carefully. At 58, the general's wife was polished and articulate, clearly comfortable in political circles. But there was genuine emotion in her eyes as she spoke about the fears that kept her awake at night. "What changed?" Margaret asked. "Why are you willing to get involved now?" Patricia stood and walked to the window, looking out at Arlington Cemetery in the distance. "Because my husband saluted you on national television, and I realized that in 27 years of military life, I've never done anything to help the women who came before me. I've been too busy protecting my own position to fight for anyone else's. And now I want to use whatever influence I have to make sure that salute means something." Patricia turned back to Margaret. "I've been making calls since Tuesday night. I've got meetings set up with congressional staff, veterans, organizations, and military family support groups. But I need you there. I need the face of this movement to be someone who's actually lived the struggle, not someone like me who's been protected by rank and privilege." Margaret felt a familiar wariness. She had been used by politicians and do-gooders before, people who wanted to feel better about themselves by helping the poor widow. "What exactly are you proposing?" Patricia sat back down and pulled out a thick folder. "A comprehensive reform package. New legislation that would treat military widows as veterans with full benefits access, increased survivor benefits tied to cost of living adjustments, mandatory family preparation programs for all military couples, and a new Pentagon office specifically focused on military family welfare with real authority and budget." "That sounds expensive," Margaret said. "Congress doesn't like expensive." "That's where you're wrong," Patricia smiled. Congress loves expensive when it's popular, and after this week, helping military widows is very popular. Senator Hayes called my husband yesterday asking for a meeting. 3 other senators have introduced preliminary bills. This is our window, Margaret. This is our chance to make real change. Over the next 2 hours, Patricia outlined a strategy that was more sophisticated than anything Margaret could have imagined. They would organize the growing network of military widows into a formal advocacy organization. They would coordinate with existing veterans groups to present a united front. And they would use Patricia's connections to get direct access to decision-makers who could actually implement change. But here's the thing, Patricia said seriously. This can't just be about money and benefits. We need to change the culture. We need to make military spouses visible, not just when they're grieving, but throughout their service. We need to recognize that military families serve together, sacrifice together, and deserve recognition together. Margaret thought about Patrick and all the sacrifices he had asked her to make. The moves, the deployments, the nights she spent alone raising their children. You're talking about fundamentally changing how the military thinks about families. Yes. And it's going to take someone with your credibility to make that argument. You can't be bought, you can't be intimidated, and you've already proven you're willing to speak truth to power. That afternoon, Margaret found herself in Senator Hayes's office on Capitol Hill, accompanied by Patricia and Dorothy Chen. The senator looked uncomfortable as he listened to their proposals, clearly calculating the political costs and benefits. The survivor benefit increases alone would cost hundreds of millions, he said, studying the legislation draft, and creating a new Pentagon office with real authority. The Defense Department isn't going to like giving up that much autonomy over family affairs. Senator, Margaret said quietly, how much do you think we've saved the country over the years? How much did it cost to not have to pay full salaries to military spouses who couldn't maintain careers because of constant moves? How much did we save by providing free childcare during deployments? How much did we save by maintaining base communities and supporting other families without any official compensation? Senator Hayes paused, clearly having never considered these questions. Dorothy Chen leaned forward. My James served 3 tours in Iraq. During each deployment, I was essentially a single mother working multiple jobs to make ends meet. I saved the military tens of thousands in childcare costs alone. When James was wounded, I became his full-time caregiver without any training or support. I saved the VA hundreds of thousands in nursing care costs. And when he died, I was discarded like I had never contributed anything. The military has been getting our labor for free for decades, Patricia added. Now we're asking for basic recognition and support. That's not unreasonable. That's justice. Senator Hayes was taking notes now, his political instincts recognizing both the moral argument and the potential public support. What do you need from me? Hearings, Margaret said immediately. Public hearings where military widows can tell their stories, where the Defense Department has to answer questions about how they're treating families, where the American people can see what we've been invisible about for so long. And we need you to champion comprehensive legislation, not just token gestures, Patricia added. Real reform that addresses the systemic problems, not just band-aid solutions. Over the following week, Margaret found herself at the center of a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and strategy sessions. The Invisible Widows movement had grown to include hundreds of military spouses and widows across the country, all sharing their stories and demanding change. But it was during a meeting with active-duty military families at Fort Belvoir that Margaret realized the full scope of what they were attempting. A young Air Force wife named Jennifer Martinez approached her after the presentation. Mrs. O'Sullivan, Jennifer said, holding her 2-year-old daughter, I've been married to a pilot for 5 years. I've moved 6 times, had 3 miscarriages during deployments, and given up 2 different career opportunities. But until I heard your story, I never thought about what would happen to me if something happened to him. Now I'm terrified. Margaret looked at the young woman and saw herself 30 years ago, hopeful, dedicated, and completely unprepared for the realities of military life. What would make you feel more secure? Knowing that if I become a widow, I won't become invisible. Knowing that my service as a military spouse will be recognized and valued. Knowing that there's a system in place to support me, not abandon me. That night, Margaret called Patricia with a new idea. "Oh, we're not just fighting for widows," she said. "We're fighting for every military family. This is about recognizing that military spouses serve too, whether their husband comes home or not." "You're absolutely right," Patricia agreed. "We need to expand our message. This is about military family equality, not just widow support." As Margaret hung up the phone, she realized that what had started as a lonely letter to a general had become something much bigger. She was no longer just fighting for recognition of her own sacrifice. She was fighting to ensure that no military family would ever be invisible again. But she also knew that their most difficult challenge lay ahead. In 2 days, she would testify before Congress, with the entire military establishment watching. The stakes couldn't be higher, and failure would mean that her moment of visibility would fade back into the shadows where military widows had always lived. The young Jennifer Martinez was counting on her. Dorothy Chen was counting on her. Patricia Thompson was counting on her. And somewhere in Section 60 of Arlington Cemetery, Margaret O'Sullivan was counting on her too. The Senate Armed Services Committee hearing room was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on screens in the hallway. Margaret O'Sullivan sat at the witness table, flanked by Patricia Thompson and Dorothy Chen, facing a panel of 26 senators who held the power to transform her week of visibility into lasting change. Behind her, the gallery was filled with military widows, active duty spouses, and veterans who had traveled from across the country to witness this moment. Senator Hayes, now the bill's primary sponsor, gavelled the hearing to order. We're here today to examine the Military Family Service Recognition Act, which would fundamentally change how our nation treats the families of those who serve. Mrs. O'Sullivan, thank you for being here. The country has been listening to your story, and Congress is ready to act. Margaret adjusted the microphone, her hands steadier than they had been at Arlington Cemetery 3 weeks earlier. She had spent the previous night reviewing her testimony with Patricia, but she knew that the most important words would come from her heart, not from prepared remarks. "Senators, I want to begin by reading you some names," Margaret said, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "Dorothy Chen, widow of Master Sergeant James Chen. Barbara Williams, widow of Sergeant First Class Robert Williams. Susan Davis, widow of Captain Michael Davis. Maria Rodriguez, widow of Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez." She looked up at the panel. "These are just 4 of the 1,847 military widows who have contacted me since my letter to General Thompson became public. Each of them has a story of service, sacrifice, and invisibility. Each of them deserves better from the country their husbands died serving." Senator Patricia Murray of Washington leaned forward. "Mrs. O'Sullivan, can you help us understand the scope of this problem? How many military widows are struggling with inadequate support?" "Senator, there are approximately 300,000 military widows in America today. Based on the responses I've received, I estimate that at least half are living below or near the poverty line. Many are elderly, isolated, and forgotten by the very institutions their husbands served." Defense Secretary Michael Harrison, seated at a separate witness table, shifted uncomfortably. He had been called to testify about the Pentagon's response to the growing controversy, and his prepared remarks suddenly seemed inadequate. Dorothy Chen spoke next, her voice carrying the authority of 8 years of struggle. "Senators, when my husband died, I lost more than my spouse. I lost my identity, my community, my security, and my future. The military that had been my family for 23 years suddenly treated me like a stranger. I wasn't invited to unit events. I wasn't included in spouse groups. I was a reminder of something people didn't want to think about." Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, himself a veteran, asked, "What would have made the biggest difference in your transition?" Recognition that my service didn't end when James died, Dorothy replied immediately. I continued to represent his legacy, to support other military families, to advocate for veterans' causes. But I did all of that while struggling to pay rent and buy groceries. If the military had treated me like a veteran instead of a dependent, everything would have been different. Patricia Thompson took the microphone next, and her testimony carried the weight of insider knowledge. Senators, I've been a military spouse for 27 years. I've seen how the system works for families of high-ranking officers, and I've seen how it fails families without connections or resources. We have a two-tiered system where your husband's rank determines your level of support even after death. What specific changes does the Military Family Service Recognition Act propose? Asked Senator John Tester of Montana. Patricia outlined the comprehensive reforms. Survivor benefits increased to 75% of base pay with annual cost of living adjustments. Full veterans benefits access for military spouses after 10 years of service. Establishment of a military family affairs office with cabinet-level authority. Mandatory financial and legal planning for all military families, and creation of a national network of military family service centers in major metropolitan areas. Indeed, the total cost is approximately $2.8 billion annually, Patricia said, which represents less than 0.4% of the defense budget. For context, that's less than we spend on a single aircraft carrier. Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Thompson, you're asking us to essentially create a new class of veteran. How do we justify giving benefits to people who never wore the uniform? Margaret had been waiting for this question. She leaned forward, her voice carrying decades of suppressed frustration. Senator, with respect, that question shows exactly why we're here today. You think military spouses don't serve because we don't wear uniforms? Let me tell you what I wore instead. She stood up, and the room fell silent. I wore the uniform of a woman who moved 17 times in 30 years, starting over in new communities, new schools, new jobs, every time the army decided Patrick was needed somewhere else. I wore the uniform of a mother who raised 2 children, essentially as a single parent, because their father was deployed 8 of their first 10 years of life. I wore the uniform of a wife who held our family together while my husband fought 2 wars that gave him nightmares for the rest of his life. Her voice was rising now, carried by years of pent-up emotion. I wore the uniform of a caregiver who nursed Patrick through PTSD, through injuries, through the psychological wounds that never fully healed. I wore the uniform of a woman who sacrificed her own career, her own dreams, her own future, because the military needed my husband and my husband needed me. The gallery erupted in applause, but Margaret wasn't finished. Adieu, and when Patrick died, Senator Graham, I wore the uniform of a woman who had given everything to this country and discovered that everything wasn't enough to earn basic recognition or support. So don't you dare tell me I never served. I served every single day for 30 years. I just didn't get paid for it. The room was electric now. Even the senators who had been skeptical were leaning forward, recognizing that they were witnessing something historic. Defense Secretary Harrison requested permission to respond. Senators, the Department of Defense recognizes that military families make tremendous sacrifices, but we must be careful about expanding benefits in ways that could compromise military readiness or fiscal responsibility. Margaret turned to face him directly. Mr. Secretary, how exactly does taking care of military widows compromise readiness? Are you suggesting that supporting the families of fallen soldiers somehow weakens our military? No, ma'am, that's not what I'm suggesting. Then what are you suggesting? Because it sounds like you're saying that the Defense Department can afford trillion-dollar weapons systems, but can't afford to properly support the families of the people who died using those weapons. Secretary Harrison had no good answer, and his silence spoke volumes. Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts took over the questioning. Mrs. O'Sullivan, you mentioned that 1,147 widows have contacted you. What are they telling you? They're telling me that they feel abandoned by their country, Margaret replied. They're telling me that they're choosing between medication and groceries. They're telling me that they're too proud to ask for help and too poor to manage without it. And they're telling me that they wish someone had prepared them for this reality. What would proper preparation look like? Margaret looked to Patricia, who had worked out the details. Every military couple should receive comprehensive financial and legal counseling within their first year of service. They should understand exactly what benefits they're entitled to, how to access them, and what their financial situation would be in the event of death or disability. No one should have to figure this out while they're grieving. Senator Marco Rubio of Florida asked about the political feasibility of such comprehensive reform. Mrs. O'Sullivan, this is a significant expansion of federal benefits. How do we ensure public support? Senator, the American people support veterans. They support military families. What they don't support is waste and inefficiency. This isn't waste. This is finally paying a debt we've owed for generations. And if Congress needs political cover, remember that there are 300,000 military widows in this country, plus their children, plus their extended families. That's a lot of voters who are watching how you handle this issue. The hearing continued for 3 hours, with testimony from veterans of groups, military family organizations, and budget analysts. But the most powerful moment came when Margaret read a letter from a young Air Force wife named Jennifer Martinez. To dear Mrs. O'Sullivan, the letter read, because of your courage, I'm no longer terrified of my future. My husband and I have started financial planning, legal preparation, and honest conversations about military life. We're still serving, but now we're serving with our eyes open. Thank you for making military families visible. As the hearing concluded, Senator Hayes announced that the committee would vote on the Military Family Service Recognition Act within 2 weeks. The preliminary vote count suggested strong bipartisan support, something that had seemed impossible just a month earlier. Outside the Capitol building, Margaret was surrounded by reporters, but she had only one thing to say. This was never about me. This was about the 300,000 women like me who have been invisible for too long. Today, Congress heard our voices. Now we need to make sure they act on what they heard. 6 months later, President Biden signed the Military Family Service Recognition Act into law in a ceremony in the Rose Garden. Margaret O'Sullivan stood behind him as he spoke about the debt America owed to military families, and she thought about Patrick, who would have been amazed to see his shy wife standing in the White House. But the real measure of success came in smaller moments. Dorothy Chen called to report that her new veterans' benefits had allowed her to move to a better apartment and afford her medications. The Military Family Affairs Office had helped hundreds of widows access services they never knew existed. Young military couples were attending mandatory financial planning sessions, preparing for futures they hoped would never come. Most importantly, military widows were no longer invisible. The network Margaret had accidentally created had grown into a formal organization with chapters in every state, providing support, advocacy, and friendship to women who had previously struggled alone. On the first anniversary of her Arlington Cemetery speech, Margaret returned to Patrick's grave in Section 60. The simple headstone now had fresh flowers, placed there by members of the local Military Family Service Center. "We did it, Patrick," she whispered, placing her hand on the cold marble. "We made sure they remember." As she walked away from the cemetery, Margaret thought about the letter that had started everything, a lonely widow's desperate plea for recognition. That letter had become a movement. The movement had become legislation, and the legislation had become hope for hundreds of thousands of families. She was no longer invisible. None of them were. The transformation was complete, but Margaret knew the work would never end. As long as there were military families serving their country, there would be a need for advocates who understood the real cost of that service. And she would be there, no longer in the shadows, but standing proudly in the light of recognition she had fought so hard to achieve. The widow had become a warrior, and her victory belonged to every military family who had ever sacrificed in silence.